Cairo, Seattle.
It's time to get schooled with the professor, John Clayton.
Welcome to Schooled with the Professor, and the subject today is the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and of course, I've been fortunate enough to be able to be voting in that room since 1988, and continuing along, and of course, along the way, we've always had Ron Borges, who we both go back a long way into the 70s covering the NFL, so Ron Borges from the Boston Herald, and has so many other places around the country, but Ron, I guess the first thing is, I don't know, we both feel, of course, now you're on the senior committee, and by the way, everybody in Seattle was so thankful, I know, of your involvement in trying to get Ken Easley up there, and of course getting voted through, and now going to be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But when was your first year, and how has that been as far as just an honor to be picking people to go into the Hall of Fame?
Well, it was tremendous. It was sad the way I got the gig was when Will McDonough passed away. So I've been there just under 20 years now. Hard to believe it's been that long. Yeah, the first year I didn't quite get it, like most of us. I think you go in there thinking, oh, okay, all right, this is good. But then when you see the reaction of players who get in, especially those who have waited for a long time, and how emotional they are about it, and you watch those speeches and realize maybe you're a little part of it, it does make you feel good. And because you're one of the people, a lot of those guys in that room call me the patron saint of lost causes, because of Kenny and Stabler and Kip and Les Richter, guys that I did feel strongly about, and I think played a small part in helping them. And he easily was one of those guys. I remember when he first came in the league. That guy, as you know, terrorized offense, and the fact that his career ended a little bit shorter than you'd like, through no fault of his own. I think it was part of the reason he sort of slipped through the cracks, and then I think also, as you know, he was an active union guy at a time when that wasn't popular, and I think that probably hurt him with some older voters, which is unfortunate. But now he's where he belongs. I'm happy for him.
Yeah, and that's the fun part about this thing, because of course we always take criticism. And that's always going to be the case, because what happens is a fan or somebody who studies the game looks at a player and says, "Oh, that's a Hall of Famer," and it's like, just because that person doesn't make it in doesn't mean he's not a Hall of Famer. But like every year when we go into the regular room to try to talk, not just the seniors, but it's like, okay, we got 15 names and 10 we're saying no to at that time. And it's not as if we're saying no forever. It's just no that year. And because we have to basically put everything in perspective and weigh who's going to go in each year.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're exactly right, John. And that the importance of that is really always been something that I was aware of, but since I moved on to the senior committee and see the depth of names in there that have never even been discussed, and guys that anybody you talk to in football will tell you, why isn't this guy or that guy in the Hall of Fame? I think observing the queue, as I call it, is more important even than I used to think, because when you have players, in my opinion, jumping the line and getting in maybe before their time, it just creates a huge backup, a growing backup amongst those seniors. And then you get in the room in the senior committee, and some guy's name comes up, you look at his resume, and you say, how'd this guy not get in the Hall of Fame? How'd this guy never even get talked about? This coming year, Rick Goffin, our pal from Dallas, has projected that we may have 13 first-team all-decade players out of the 15 possible players. Well, if you can only put in 5, what does that tell you? It means, 8 all-decade players will have no chance to get into the Hall of Fame because there's no chair, not because we don't think they're Hall of Famers. And that's what you're right. I think that's what people don't understand. Fans certainly don't understand.
Now, we'll start with 2 names that people mention so often. Why aren't they in the Hall of Fame? And we'll start with one senior. And Jerry Kramer's always been a guy that has been mentioned and say, oh, how come Jerry Kramer from the Green Bay Packers never made it into the Hall of Fame? And, of course, now he's in the senior group. Can you kind of give an explanation of Jerry Kramer?
It's funny. You're right, because it's a name that always comes up, and I'm a big advocate for Jerry Kramer. And as you know, I do this weekly Talk of Fame network radio show that's devoted to the history of the game, the Hall of Fame, and stuff. I was talking to Paul Hornung this very week, 2 days ago, in fact, and he said, it's a terrible injustice that Jerry Kramer's not in the Hall of Fame. He was the best guard in football, and I ran behind him. Well, that carries a lot of weight with me. I understand he's a teammate, but, it was such a ringing endorsement. So it's always been baffling to me. You've heard me talk about it in the room. here's a guy who was picked as the only guard on the 50th anniversary NFL team. How on earth you can put out a team, and you can say what you will or may about that team, but nearly everybody on it's in the Hall of Fame, with the exception of Jerry Kramer. Now, how's that possible? If you say this guy was the best guard to play in the first 50 years of professional football, it's just a travesty of justice. But I think he got caught up as one too many Packers. I think that's, for a long time, that's I really think that's what it came down to. They put in so many that there was a thought that, geez, you put in any more Packers, you better throw Lombardi out because he should have won every year if he had that many Hall of Fame players. But he did, And then I think as time passes, now you've got guys in there that never saw Jerry Kramer, don't know anything about him or very little about him. And naturally enough, it's a natural reaction to think, well, wait a minute. Those guys who knew him best didn't put him in.
Yeah, and that's
now I'm going to vote to put him in,
Well, and that's the thing, too, because, I know having covered the Steelers all through the 70s, when you're out there on the West Coast doing Raider stuff and all the other good stuff, is that, like in the case of the Steelers, it almost becomes too many Steelers because, two guys that I know that are under consideration, Donnie Shell and L.C. Greenwood, I've always thought should go in. But, of course, as you know, I'm the most positive guy in the room for the senior committee because I always make the speech and say, listen, these guys research this. They understand the cue. They understand what's been waiting and all that stuff. So support this and don't say no, because it's a yes or no vote when you're talking about seniors. Right.
And I agree with you on both those guys, Donnie Shell and L.C. Green. In fact, I said to some voters this year when they were talking about sort of wringing their hands over Brian Dawkins and John Lynch and what are we going to do? And I said, well, let me tell you, in my opinion, no disrespect to either one of those guys. We're not talking about whether or not they belong in. But Donnie Shell and Jack Tatum were better than both of them. Neither one of them are in the Hall of Fame, and Jack Tatum's never going to get in. And Donnie probably isn't going to. And I've talked to a lot of football people, and many of them still coaching, who say the same thing about Donnie Shell. And LC, I don't get it. You and I covered them. We watched them play. I saw what happened, when they would play the Raiders in those important games. And you had to deal with L.C. Greenwood. And I think, like Jerry Kramer, he just got caught up in those numbers. And once that door closes, it's hard to open it.
I still remember Dan Jenkins writing this for SI in that first Super Bowl that I covered, which was the Steelers and Minnesota Vikings. Fran Tarkenton was the quarterback, and in that game, I think L.C. Greenwood batted down 4 passes. And so kind of in an amusing type of lead, Dan Jenkins came back and he says, after the game, Fran Tarkenton was so frustrated, he was taking the football and throwing it to the ground in frustration, and it was batted down by L.C. Greenwood.
Exactly. Yeah, he was a game-changing player, and a great player, and who made a lot of things possible for that defense. But then time goes by, and next thing you know, there's less and less guys like us who saw him at his peak, and more guys saying, how did he get passed over? Or why did he get passed over? And you know how it works. Sometimes a lot of guys who they're not really being passed over, but I was afraid it was going to happen to Will Shields, the great offensive guard from Kansas City, because there's 3 or 4 years there where he didn't get in. And everybody would say the same thing. He's a great player, Hall of Fame player. We'll get him in next year. Then next year didn't come. And all of a sudden you look up 10 years go by, and now half the people in the room never saw Will Shields. And it becomes a little more difficult for a player like that, especially one with no discernible statistics.
Well, and before we get into current affairs, and one of the things I know Rick Gosselin always talks about and brings up is that there's such a disparity in the Hall of Fame of defensive players versus offensive players, because it seems like there's been a pattern where now more offensive players have gotten in, and the disparity is really hurting a lot of the defensive players who deserve to get in.
Yeah, no, it's about 2 to 1. It's about the Hall is about 2/3 offensive players and 1/3 defensive players. This year's finalist, it was just about that, 2/3, 1/3, 9-4, and I think in general, that's the way it's gone. Part of it is the statistics, of course. It's easier to quantify a guy who rushed for 14,000 yards and scored, 150 touchdowns or whatever, than a guy who plays defensive tackle in a 2-gap defense. But that doesn't mean he's not a great player, and I think it's something that we need to think about. I tend to vote for more defensive players than offensive players when we're cutting down to 25 and when we're cutting down to 15, just in the hopes of getting some in. And I think it's something that we have to, I don't know how, if address it is the right word, but I think it's something that the voters should all be thinking about.
talking to Ron Borges from the Boston Herald about the Pro Football Hall of Fame. All right, let's go current affairs. Let's talk an offensive player. Let's talk a statistics magnet. Terrell Owens has not made it in the first 2 years of being up for a vote. And, of course, a lot of people, including T.O., who's been ripping the Hall of Fame for that. Explain the T.O. phenomenon.
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on with him. The first one being that he had a lot of problems on every team he ever played on. And eventually all those teams got rid of him one way or another, some faster than others. Bill Parcells, for example, coached him in Dallas. And this year sort of tried to come out in support of him. But by the time you were done reading his endorsement, you weren't sure if he was sure that the guy belongs in the Hall of Fame. When you're talking about a receiver and you say, well, there are a lot of times he ran 12-yard routes when it should be 9 yards, but he was productive. And, he was a handful, but he was productive. Well, guys running the 12-yard routes when they're supposed to be 9-yard routes oftentimes equal interceptions, which equal losing games. The thing I find interesting about him, however, is that when people quote his statistics, and they are numerous and impressive, the one stat that they ignore, which I find he brought up when the brouhaha started this year after he didn't get in, is that in 7 of his 15 years in the NFL, he was in the top 4 in drop passes, and twice he led the league in drop passes. Well, if you're not running routes properly part of the time, you're disrupting your team part of the time, and you're in the top 4 for drop passes half your career, it's probably not quite the slam dunk that people who just look at 2 numbers or 3 numbers think it might be. I think he's a Hall of Famer. I think he'll get in. I don't think he's been unfairly treated to this point.
And that's the one thing that happens now. One rule that we have is we are only judging what happens on the field. But one thing that we did get clarification for, if it goes into the locker room where there's problems between the player and his teammates, player and the team, that does affect things because it does affect the chemistry of the team and the results of the team. And so that is at least judgment because, what he does outside of football means nothing. We can't really judge that. But if it has an effect on the team itself, then it does go into the equation.
Right, and I think that's fair. I don't think that certainly I don't think of myself as some moral arbiter. It's just about football. And I think that's the way it should be. I wish baseball was like that. And they're very clear about that. But your effect on your team is part of football. And I think, I know Paul Domovitz in the Philadelphia Daily News, who was a supporter of T.O., wrote a piece after the fact, wanted to make sure his constituents knew that he had voted for him. But even him during that had a piece, a quote from Brian Dawkins, in which Dawkins said, it took 2 years for our team to recover from what went on when T.O. was here. Well, that ought to count too. That's got to count too. Assuming what Dawkins says is true, and I'll certainly take him at his word. So, I'm not a big first ballot Hall of Fame guy, as you know. You've heard me talk about it before. We've talked about it before. I get it, but I just don't think that anybody ever gets stopped and says, so how many ballots did it take you to get in the Hall of Fame? You're either Hall of Famer or you're not. But having said that, I do recognize that there are the few guys, you say Jim Brown, that's the end of the story. You say John Elway, that's the end of the story. I don't think Terrell Owens is that player. Jerry Rice was that player. He's not Jerry Rice. I knew Jerry Rice. Jerry Rice was a friend of mine. Terrell Owens, no Jerry Rice.
But that's the one thing, too, that I know from years, particularly of late. You talk about numbers, and now the numbers get skewed, and wide receivers maybe get graded a little bit harshly compared to other positions. I think, what is it now in the last, 2 or 3 decades, there's been 18 running backs and 12 wide receivers that have gone in, and sometimes it takes a longer time for wide receivers because in the 70s when we started covering, receivers didn't get the ball. I mean, it was only 15 to 20 passes thrown, and now you can have 40 to 50 passes thrown, and you can have several wide receivers with 100-catch years. And so a lot of the times the receivers gets lost in the numbers and may take him a little bit longer to get in.
Right. Well, sure, and you'll remember this, I'm sure, because you were one of the many people laughing at me a few years ago when I lost my mind in the room there during the debate about the 4 receivers when we had Tim Brown and Reed and Carter and Malk. Those guys were all sort of stuck together. And I finally said, look, Wes Welker's going to catch 100 passes every year for 5 or 6 years. Do you think he's a Hall of Famer? The numbers don't mean anything. anymore. And I remember a lot of guys laughed, and somebody finally said, "I guess you don't think Wes Welker's a Hall of Famer?" I said, "No, I don't." You know? And the game has changed so much. Well, you can just run free; they can't touch you. You can run a shallow cross; nobody can take your neck off with a clothesline like Jack Lambert or Dick Butkus would have done. They can't touch the quarterback. It's a completely different game. So to look at those numbers, like Terrell Owens' numbers, and say, "Well, see that?" I've had people say, "Look, he's the second best receiver to ever play football. Look at the numbers." And I said, maybe that's what the numbers tell you, but that's not what your eyes tell you. And that's the difference, I think, in particular with him. And he's become a lightning rod, no question about it. And I think in the case of some public people, they don't really give a damn about Terrell Owens one way or the other. It's just a way to get their own clicks taken care of or whatever it is that it's all about. It's not really about Terrell Owens.
Yeah, but ultimately he will get into the Hall of Fame. I know I voted for him this year. I'll vote for him next year, and at some point he'll get in, and he can take his yellow jacket that has all the numbers on it and maybe trade it in for one of the yellow jackets given by the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Right, but I'll tell you, John. Here's the difference. When Billy Houghton retired in 1963, he was with the Cowboys at that point, but he played most of his career with the Packers. He was the leading receiver, all-time leading receiver in receptions and yardage. He never once had his case debated by the Hall of Fame committee, and never once did anybody raise a word about it because he wasn't a Hall of Fame receiver. You know, the numbers would tell you he was the best receiver of his time, but he wasn't. You know, you've got to be careful. If it's just about numbers, what do they need us for?
Exactly.
Just run the numbers through a computer and spit them out.
Well, I'll tell you what, Ron, we could probably go on forever, but I don't want this to go longer than some of the Saturdays we spend together in the afternoon, morning, and toward the evening in the meeting. But I thank you so much for taking the time to explain this because it's a fascinating subject, and we have a lot of fun in that room.
No, we do, John. I'll just leave your listeners with this thought. Remember one thing. Numbers are like hostages. You can make them say anything you want.
There you go. Ron Borges, thank you for joining us.
Okay, Josh.
That's it for this week's edition of Schooled. You can follow me on Twitter at ClaytonESPN. Thanks for listening. Class dismissed.